If all I do is I pull out inspirational bits out of the Bible, I'm prostituting scripture to get amens. The goal is to actually help people to learn the Bible. I think right now we're in a church space where there's a lack of like real accountability. Okay, you have a board, but that board is less like a group of your friends. There's gotta be somebody in your life saying, are you watching your life? And are you watching your doctrine?
A pastor turned tech leader and a millennial churchgoer explore the intersection of technology, culture, and faith, equipping you with innovative strategies to support you as you live out your calling, lead your churches with confidence, and step into the future together. This is the Give It Up Podcast. Welcome back to the Give It Up Podcast, and today we have to give it up for none other than the man, the myth, the legend. It's Manny Arango right here. And Manny knows that I love puns, especially with him. He's wearing a rude shirt if you're watching this on YouTube. So I introed by saying I don't mean to be rude, but it looks like you did mean to be rude. So we're having a good time already here on the podcast today. But Manny, you are a dynamic speaker, preacher. You are also a social media pastor, I would say. In fact, that's how I found you through that. And you also have Bible courses online, which I think is a dynamic pairing. So today, we want to focus on the topic of millennial mindsets when it comes to reading the Bible, because we couldn't think of anyone better than you to discuss this with. So I first want to know, Manny, how has Bible reading and the concept of it changed through the generations? Let's say baby boomers, now to Gen X, millennials, and of course, Gen Z coming up as well.
Yeah, good question.
Boy, how's it changed? I think that, so my context for baby boomers are my parents, okay? Like, my parents are both boomers, and I would say that for both of my parents, like, there wasn't like a question of like a separation between what does the text say versus what does the text mean. And I don't know that they were asking like a hermeneutical or exegetical question when it came to the separation between what does the text say versus what does it mean. And I think millennials and Gen Z are asking that question. I think that like what would normally have been found only in seminary, like for 2 generations ago, is now like on YouTube. So I think there's an access to information that is a blessing and a curse. So let's talk about the blessing and let's talk about the curse. The blessing of it is that the potential for millennials and Gen Z to be more biblically literate is astronomical. Like we don't have to pay $40,000-$50,000 a year to go to seminary to become biblically literate. The access to that information is now, at our fingertips. That's the blessing. Here's the curse, is that the average person doesn't know how to weed out like good, healthy, what I would say theologically conservative, historical confessional Christianity from people who just sound smart. So, like, there's a lot of people on TikTok who sound smart, but they are, they don't know what they're talking about. And so, I'll give you a good example, right? This may be controversial. We'll see. I always like to tell, like, the young people at our church, or really their parents, when I was a youth pastor for 10 years, and I would always tell parents, the first person to expose a child to something becomes the expert on that topic. So the very first person to expose them to sex becomes the expert. So you have a decision to make. The 8th grader who's exposing a 5th grader to sexual, content could become the expert on that, or you as the parent could become the expert. The decision's really up to you. And so I think that a lot of times, pastorally, I think pastors who have gone to seminary know, man, there are some complicated, tough things to deal with in the Bible. And if I expose that to middle school students and high school students first, then I get to say, hey, I know that there are inconsistencies with these texts. However, I'm still a Christian, and I still believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and these inconsistencies that a TikToker who's deconstructing is gonna expose you to is going to lead you to believe that this is a reason to leave the faith. Whereas I'm gonna expose you to this, and I'm gonna tell you this is not a reason to leave the faith. If pastors are not honest about, issues in scripture, and I say issues in quotes, then I think what we end up doing is we communicate a couple things. A, we knew and we didn't tell, which means we're hiding things. Or we don't know, which means we're not educated enough to actually be preaching and teaching the word. And so, I used to tell the kids in my youth group straight up, the Bible is not a guide for dating. So we're gonna talk about this dating series, and we're not gonna use the Bible because in the cultural context of the Bible was arranged marriage. There is no dating. And so it would actually really, it would be dishonest of me to preach a sermon about Ruth and Boaz and convince you that this is how we should then learn how to date. Because the reality of the situation is you're not trying to marry your uncle, and if all I do is I pull out inspirational bits out of the Bible, then I'm prostituting scripture to get amens, and that's not actually the goal. Is to actually help people to learn the Bible. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of recap all the things that I said because I kind of went on a stream of.
No. Let me try, Manny. Let me try. So the thread that I'm taking is this sub theme of credibility. Okay. And so something that builds credibility is actually accessibility. And so what you're saying is that with young people, sometimes if a TikTok influencer got to them first, right, because they were accessible, they're building some level of authority and credibility in that young person's life when it comes to things like maybe TikTok theology or whatever, right? What you're saying is one way that we as pastors might be able to counteract that is being intellectually honest about our approach, right? And so providing context also can build credibility. I always say this because I think it's so interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon, right? Where a lot of my friends that are single, they get relationship advice from other people that are single. So I guess context is one way to build credibility. Historically, when we talk about Boomer, even Gen X, certification, right? So the same analogy of like going to a married person for maybe relationship advice being wise, it would be similar to going to a certified individual, whether it's an ordained pastor or whether it's somebody that's gotten a certification in theology, whatever that certification looks like. What I'm realizing, though, especially for millennials and Gen Z, is that those certifications are meaning less and less.
Exactly.
Why is my question to you? And is that trend going to continue? And if it does, is that good or bad?
Well, we've got to find credibility somewhere. And I think we're finding less and less credibility in this certification. Because there's this so let's say in my field, right? There's a bunch of people who went into debt to get a Master's of Divinity. That's the MDiv is the gold standard for pastors and preachers and leaders. But then you could have an MDiv and not lead a thriving church, not understand how to evangelize, not know how to do marriage counseling, or not know how to talk about finances in a way that actually prompts generosity in the church. So you could do all this and then still not do, and I mean successful. I'm making sure that we draw a line between faithful and successful.
Correct.
So I want to be both. I want to be both faithful with what God's given me, and I want some metrics that show that I am successful, that I am fruitful, okay? I think sometimes we try to create a false dichotomy. Well, you can either be faithful or fruitful. And actually, I think in an ideal world, you can be both. Now, we don't always have ideal worlds. I think that the institution of the seminary somewhere along the way forgot that their primary client was the senior pastor. So not only are they not preparing that person for the ministry well, but then they are not giving any ongoing training to help that person flourish, right? Chuck E. Cheese has to realize that the real client is not my 2-year-old, that the real client is me. My 2-year-old can't pay for Chuck E. Cheese, right? So I'm actually the person they need to win over, which is why, I don't know if you've seen all these viral videos at Chuck E. Cheese where they got beer at Chuck E. Cheese now and parents get drunk and they start fighting. It's actually very, very funny. If you type in drunk people at Chuck E. Cheese on Twitter, you can have a blast for 10 straight minutes. But I think what we're saying is that, hey, okay, there's a vicious cycle. Pastors are becoming successful without the certification, and the certification is becoming less and less relevant. However, at some point, you reach a breaking point, and now we have pastors going viral for saying things on stage that are theologically inaccurate. So now the pendulum swings back to, do any of these people have degrees? Who certified these individuals? So because the institution failed to train pastors, pastors realized if I'm anointed and if I'm gifted, and if I join with a phenomenal organization like ARC, I could get relevant training to actually help me to grow my church, but at what cost? And that cost has become, we're executives and leaders and marketers and fundraisers and building builders, but have neglected, I think we forgot we also have to be theologians and we have to be biblically literate as pastors, as leaders. And I think we're gonna go, okay, who's now gonna be, where is the place where we can get certification that's gonna do all of the things? So I think it's a constant kind of
no, this is disruptive thinking, man. This is really disruptive thinking. And I want to get to...
ARC has done the same thing with denominations. People
100%.
used to find trust in a denomination. If it's Methodist or if it's Baptist or if it's whatever, I kind of know that, okay, the pastor could go off the rails, but I believe in this Methodist institution. The pastor could lose his mind, but I believe in being Baptist. The Southern Baptist Convention, for the very first time in 100 years, had the biggest decline in membership last year. And so I think we're going, okay, we're seeing a shift from trust in organizations to trust in individuals. And what's going to end up happening? Well, we're one Carl Lentz away from what? The pendulum going back to, we need to trust in organizations again because we've trusted in people. And I think what we need to find is that there's actually a healthy, God-ordained balance between both institutions and people. That actually it's not either or, but institutions and people have to figure out a way where your personal brand and the brand of the institution can both elicit trust within people and provide that level of certification. Okay, that's kind of
No, I like how you put it. It's a balance between faithful and fruitful, right? I mean, story time, really quick. I'm based in the Silicon Valley. And when I started my career at Google, one thing in my head, just because, I grew up with Gen X parents and this was just kind of my mindset, is that, at one point I need to get an MBA because I want to be prolific in business. So I need to get an MBA. And I remember sharing my ambition to get an MBA with my manager at Google, and he laughed at me. This dude laughed at me. He's like, if you get an MBA and come back to Google, you're going to be the laughing stock in the office. Because they thought it was a joke. They're all building world-changing technology and none of them have MBAs. They're just straight up builders, right? Yeah. And that's a similar thing where in the church space, it seems like pendulum is swung to, hey, no, we're just straight up builders. But then, a decade later, I'm starting to see some issues with some of these founders of like these titan organizations, big tech now, that didn't have maybe a values-based or moral framework, and now it's getting them into trouble, right?
Yeah.
And so in a similar way, in a very specific business vein, I'm starting to see the pendulum swing towards wanting to see managers that have like governance principles, that know how to contextually integrate these new innovative breakthroughs into society in a morally responsible way, right? I mean, the whole conversation around AI right now is you have people super bullish on it, and then you got other big technologists like Elon that's trying to pump the brakes because he's like, hey, have we thought about user safety? And in the same way, I kind of hear that thread with you is like, okay, hold up. We're in this moment of time. Cool. The church is alive. The church is well. We're building buildings. We're gaining followers on social media. We're making a dent in society. We're culturally relevant, all those things. But hey, is anybody thinking about user safety?
Yeah. And I am.
Okay, so that's what I want to get to. You're not just critiquing this, you're contributing towards it with Arma, what you're doing with Arma. Can you talk a little bit about that and your perspective, your approach?
Yeah, so 2020, I realized, man, this vicious cycle between seminary and church is like, this is a broken system, and somebody has to model that they can go to school even though they don't need it. So I decided to jump into a doctoral program. And that doctoral program has not, like somebody one time on a Zoom call said, what doors is your doctoral program opening for you? And I said, well, I didn't jump into the program for it to open doors for me. That's a terrible way to think about a discipline. I jumped into a doctoral program to show Pentecostals that you can do this. Stop saying that you can't, or that you don't have time, or that you're too busy. Stop making excuses. When the Holy Spirit asked me to jump into a doctoral program, first I had to get my master's degree because I hadn't got a master's degree. And so that was 2 years of my life. And then I jumped into a 4-year doctoral program, and the Holy Spirit said, this is your act of worship to me. I want you to sacrifice something and go to school, because there are young people coming up behind you that think that school's irrelevant. And the problem is that you actually need the discipline of a professor reading over your sermon and saying, yeah, I think you're a little right on this. I think you're a little left on this. Here's the center line. I gained professors along the way that have become allies for me, that watch me preach and will hold me accountable. I think right now we're in a church space where there's a lack of like real accountability. Okay, you have a board, but that board is less like a group of your friends. And like, who can really say, hey, like the random person on YouTube isn't the person to hold you accountable. I hate these people who like review people's sermons on YouTube. I'm like, get a life. The person, because there can't be accountability without relationship. So there's gotta be somebody in your life who's just like Paul saying to Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely. Because if you excel in them, you'll save both yourself and your hearers. I think there's got to be someone saying, are you watching your life? And are you watching your doctrine? I'll give a shift, I think, that has taken place, like a generational shift. I actually learned this in my master's program. So before World War II, prior to World War II, if you went to any church and you got a meeting with the pastor, the secretary would usher you into that pastor's study. Every pastor had a study because the pastor was the public theologian. The pastor's job is to study, is to make sure that they are preaching doctrine that is Presbyterian, or doctrine that's Baptist, or doctrine that's Methodist, or doctrine that's based on whatever denomination they're in. Well, the World War II hits, America becomes a superpower, and the number one most admired person in the public space becomes the CEO. And so every pastor goes from having a study to having an office. And why do I have an office? Because I'm a CEO. I'm the chief executive officer. I go from being a theologian to being an officer. And if we look at church, now there's a lot of positives that have happened because of this. This is not only a negative thing. I want to talk with nuance, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of positives that have happened because of this. Church becomes relevant, all the things that you kind of mentioned before. Like, churches are thriving, they're growing, they're culturally relevant. Like, hey, we're building buildings in cash, like, we're debt-free, we're doing all kinds of phenomenal things. And I'm going, okay, we can't go back to the past, so what does the future look like? And I think the future has to be some kind of, I would call it a studio. It's a study, but that is tech infused. It's back to, hey, we're gonna be theologians again. We gotta be like, we gotta know what the doctrines of the church are. We can't let 2020 hit and waves of millennials deconstruct, and there's no response. There's no, we're all just mad at the kids deconstructing. It's like, we're all just pointing our fingers at people deconstructing. And to me, you know, Paul says to the Corinthian church, I laid a foundation of none other than Christ, and then the fire will reveal what we've all built. He says, some build with gold, some with silver, some with costly stones, some with wood, some with hay. And what happens when you build with wood and hay? The fire burns it up and consumes it. What happens when you build with gold, silver, and costly stones? The fire refines it and makes it better. So Paul is saying that if somebody can deconstruct what you built, maybe the issue is not the person deconstructing. Maybe the issue is that you built it wrong. Maybe the problem is with the church. Maybe the problem is with the pastor who built it on cultural assimilation to cultural values in a church and not on, like, hey, the Nicene Creed. Like, when's the last time you cracked open the Nicene Creed and read it? And maybe we shouldn't be building it on, hey, we vote for this political party, or maybe we should be building this on, hey, there's actually just some, like, foundational, and when I say historic confessional Christianity, I mean, hey, there's the Nicene Creed is, Christians have all agreed since 325 AD, hey, this is what defines a Christian. And so I kind of go, there's some ancient paths that I think we kind of need to, like, go back to, but not to glorify the past, but to go, okay, like, what does it mean for us to create credibility? How do we create credibility? We can't just point at people deconstructing and being like, y'all are idiots. We gotta go. So I'll give you a good example, right? TikTok, this youth group kids, they're like, and I learned, it's funny because I'll say more than one thing. Okay, here's the first issue. My issue is not with deconstruction. There's no problem with deconstructing, not at all. If you're not deconstructing your faith, then you're not constructing your faith. Faith is a process of deconstructing and reconstructing. No issue with deconstructing. Here's the issue with detaching yourself from the church and deconstructing in your room by yourself, or deconstructing with your boyfriend who's not really saved, or deconstructing with a group of friends in college that are not a part of the church. You can deconstruct all you want as long as you stay connected with your pastor and small group leaders and deacons and elders. As long as you stay attached to the church is a great place to answer your questions and to ask hard questions. Or I should say, church should be a great place to ask hard questions and to explore some difficult topics. I learned this my freshman year of my undergraduate degree, and it's crazy how I learned something as a 17-year-old, and the context in which I learned it did not cause me to deconstruct. But then I'm like 33, we're going through a pandemic, and my kids, there are kids in our youth ministry and young adult ministry at our church that are getting exposed to the exact same information, and for them, it's crumbling their faith. And here's what it is. Freshman year of Bible college, I learned that feet can be, not all the time, can be a euphemism for genitalia in the Bible, okay?
Wow.
This is like, it's not very hard to even learn this.
Right.
And so, there's a couple of different ways to read Ruth's interaction with Boaz on the threshing floor, okay? One interpretation, which is a big, people who want to push purity culture are like, Ruth and Boaz were pure, and they didn't do anything before marriage. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. But there's another way to read the text, that when she lies at his feet, that maybe something sexual did happen. Now, I learned this my freshman year in Bible college, and here's the takeaway. The takeaway was, the reason that the story of Ruth is in the Bible is to show us the lineage of David, and to show us who the Messiah is, and to show us that even in Jesus's lineage, there was always a multicultural and multi-ethnic vision that God had. That although Ruth was not an Israelite, she is grafted in because Gentiles are not an afterthought. Gentiles are a massive part of God's vision. That's why this book is in the Bible. Therefore, if Ruth and Boaz did something sexual before they were married, I don't really care, because this book is not here to teach me how to date in the 21st century. This book is to teach me about Jesus, because Jesus is way more important than me and my dating life. Now, my kids hear this. They're like, Ruth and Boaz did something sexual, then I have the right to do something sexual. And there I go. This is the difference between baby boomers encountering the Bible and millennials encountering the Bible. Baby boomers could not go on YouTube and find out that feet is a euphemism for genitalia. They're not, YouTube doesn't exist. They don't have access to that information unless their pastor is gonna get up and say that on a Sunday, and most times their pastor's not gonna say that. I think we, people leading the church right now, have to realize that we have to be more intelligent in the defense of the Bible that we give and in how we preach. If we preach self-centered messages, then we'll always take the Bible and say, what can I help you to learn about your life? Which is really just a lot of self-help. I think we really need to return to a place where we say, yeah, the story of Ruth isn't in here to help you navigate your life. The story of Ruth is in here to show you God's plan of salvation through the Old Testament. That's why it's here. And so you're not here on Sunday for a self-help talk. You're here on Sunday to actually learn what the Bible teaches. And if I'm here for a self-help talk, then guess what? I'll deconstruct when I figure out that the stuff I thought was a sure foundation was actually not what I should have been building on in the first place. So I think that we have to acknowledge, I think that, you know, when I was growing up, right, if my parents got like a Bishop Jakes DVD or a CD or DVD, like they would go back to my home church and tell our pastor, my pastor was big on, my senior pastor at the church I grew up at was like, hey, if you're gonna eat other grass, just let me know what the grass is so I could tell you whether or not it's healthy, you know what I mean? And so I remember my parents coming back from a trip and they got some cassette tapes and some DVDs and they showed it to one of the deacons at the church, hey, we got this stuff, what do you think? And my pastor kind of gave the thumbs up, yep, that stuff's great teaching to listen to, go for it. I think that if we're looking at millennials and Gen Z, sheep are just eating grass from everywhere. They're eating poison grass. They're eating grass on TikTok. They're eating grass. I was sitting down with a young adult at our church, and I'm giving them biblically sound, relevant relationship advice. Yes. I'm like, hey, dude, here's the deal. I've known you for years. I've known the girl you're dating. I'm at coffee with you. I love you. I'm your shepherd. I'm your pastor. Yeah. Here's some relationship, direction. This man quotes Mike Todd to me. He said, well, Mike Todd said in his last sermon, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, bro, let me tell you right now, I know Mike Todd personally, and if I told him that you did this to a pastor, he'd be pissed. Bro, I'm speaking in generalities. It's only your pastor who can speak in specificities. Wow. And I think that if you're gonna lead in the space that we're in today, then you've gotta be the kind of leader who knows how to know the grass that your sheep are freaking eating. I can't operate from the assumption that they're not getting grass elsewhere. I've got to operate from the assumption that, like, yeah, there is content that is accessible to you because of the internet, and now I have to train you. I can't just say this is where you eat grass. I have to give the sheep enough discernment to know what's bad grass and what's good grass. And that means I have to help them to be biblically literate so they can, like, steer themselves away from bad grass. Because I can't helicopter parent all the people in our church. I can't micromanage what everybody listens to. I have to give them a better diet so that they go, I don't know about that. Okay, so that's a lot of thoughts at once. That's
It's awesome.
I feel like
it's so good. It's so good. It reminds me that I love that idea that we can't micromanage everything. We can't helicopter mom everything, right, so to speak. And it reminds me of just the tenet of free speech, right? The antidote to promoting free speech is not actually censorship. It's not actually trying to reduce speech. The antidote to promoting free speech is more speech, right?
Yes.
And so part of me, and the whole premise of this podcast really is you have a person that sits in the seat of executive pastor that's also a technologist that's passionate about innovation, and then Zoe being a millennial churchgoer. I'm on maybe the higher end of the millennial age spectrum. Zoe's on the lower end, so we kind of create that type of diversity there. But when I think about from a technology perspective, what this means, it does kind of actually mean a training, like you said, Manny, of bringing back orthodoxy into our study and into our scripture and into our preaching, but also a leveling of the playing field in terms of technological distribution of that study.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
And so even I had this thought with a friend I was talking to the other day of like, hey, at the end of the day, any local church pastor that wants to show up digitally, every local church pastor should have an opportunity for a podcast separate from what they're preaching on a Sunday and in another context to pastor their people. Even if they only have 300 views, only if they have like 150 views or listens a week. If that's your congregation, it's going to be a lot more contextual than somebody that's just broadcasting, like you said, generalities, right? I guess, Zoe, as a younger millennial churchgoer, what are other things that produce credibility? And I mean, you're a local active church member.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I just keep hearing is this concept of the future doesn't belong to the creator as much as the future belongs to the curator. And so it's this whole concept of, if you don't provide us the answers we're looking for, guess what? We're going elsewhere, which means we're going to the buffet and nothing is the same. Nothing makes sense. It's just this whole smorgasbord of who knows what's here. I'm just eating because I'm hungry, you know? And so I love this idea, Manny, where you're seeing there's a wide open space, literally the example of a pasture of, I need to put something here to show people, hey, what's here is good. Yeah. And it will satisfy you in the same way that the church should be. And, you know, I love the parallel because, Vance, what we're building at Overflow is ultimately creating a hub for people to be able to give anything. So Manny's here creating resources for people to get the answers to all their questions. And it's just this really perplexing idea. And I love how this conversation has gone because it has really revealed to me that even as churchgoers, of course, this whole deconstruction element that's big, we have to be so mindful of what we are consuming, where we are putting our time and where we are putting our efforts and our thoughts. Like it really is a call to action for me too, not even speaking as a church leader. Because everything you're saying is really landing for me. And it's actually making me so encouraged because, Manny, you have such a boldness about you that seems to be few and far between. The fact that you're standing here and you're like, hey, I'm one of these people and I'm going forward into this unknown territory and creating the resources and saying the stuff that people are afraid to say because I want to provide people answers and help them to be well fed. I just want to commend you for that because
thanks.
It's a beautiful work and it's so necessary.
I'm like, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to and I feel like in a way I am like, this is the first moment, and we're documenting this moment on cameras, of me realizing, oh, I'm innovating. I didn't realize I was innovating until right now.
Yeah, man.
Because
yes,
it has always just felt like, man, when I'm in church space, I'm one of the only people that's really pursuing education. And when I'm with my classmates and when I'm at school, I'm one of the only people who's really trying to push church forward. And so it just feels like I'm a loner. It just feels like, oh, I don't really get anywhere.
Yeah, we say this, you can always tell a pioneer by the arrows on their back, right? And so it is a little bit of that journey, and you're totally an innovator. You're totally a disruptor. And the reason why we started this podcast to talk about innovative ideas and to talk about disruptive thinking, specifically in the church context, because both Zoe and I, our whole company is passionate about serving the local church, is because if you look at certain tectonic shifts in evangelism, certain tectonic shifts in the gospel being unleashed on this planet, certain tectonic shift of where faith has been integrated and contextualized deep within communities, it's been because of innovation. If you go
absolutely
way, way back to even the way that they constructed the original cathedrals, and a lot of them are empty now because they stopped innovating. But back in the day, it was the hub, the epicenter of society, even just the way they told the gospel story through the windows and through the way that light refracts off these different angles and things like that was architectural genius. You fast forward to the Gutenberg press and unleashing text so that it could be democratized to people, right? It's a similar thing we're trying to do in regards to finances and mixing it in with your faith and understanding the importance of the tithe and how to unlock generosity above and beyond the tithe and how that can lead to a flourishing life, biblically speaking, and things like that, all the way to what you're now seeing in terms of what needs to be disrupted, what needs to be innovated with Bible literacy. I think that's where it kind of boils down to, right? Is how, there's some good things, there's some appetite in the atmosphere right now. It just needs to be directed, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say the Reformation doesn't happen without the printing press. It just doesn't. And there's no, obviously there's no way to historically prove that, right? I'm making a bold claim, but there were reformers prior to Martin Luther who said the same things. But the innovation, the technology, the tech, of there being a printing press and him being able to actually spread his ideas. When John and Charles Wesley invented the track, that was tech. It was innovative. It was mind-blowing. If you hand out a track today, people will think you're a Jehovah's Witness or just weird.
Right, right.
And so I think sometimes it's there's all these moments where the church is innovated, but there's all these moments where the church hesitates to innovate. And obviously we're at another one of those crossroads, and we gotta go, man, we 100% need to innovate. And innovation doesn't mean we're always gonna get it right.
No.
I think sometimes we're scared to experiment and get it wrong. And I think sometimes as pastoral leaders, one of the best advice somebody gave me a couple years ago was hey man, don't just, as your default, don't always say, God told me to do this.
Yes.
Because guess what? As a leader, you're going to have to eat those words. He's your employees and your crew, sometimes they just need to hear you say, I think this is a good idea. And I think this is wise. And I think we should innovate in this way. I'm not about to add godly authority and godly pressure to like
Totally.
make you buy into the vision.
Totally.
I just have to like, and sometimes I think when pastors want to innovate, their default is, I heard from God and God told us to do this. And then there's all this pressure for that innovation to work out.
You're afraid to fail. You're
has
afraid to fail,
space.
right? Exactly.
Exactly. There has to be space within an innovative culture is a space where failure's okay. And I think sometimes in church, because there's that pressure of like, we just need to do what God told us to do. We don't innovate. And I'm like, man, like I'm all about obeying God. Don't get it twisted. But God's also given you creativity and like he's given you like
agency,
brilliance, and he's given you ideas. So
that's
I think
so
that's
good.
if I could give some kind of language to like the crossroads that I think a lot of like church leaders get to, and why they don't innovate or why they're scared to innovate. I think if we could just give people permission to like, hey, like just because you're a pastor doesn't mean that your experimental days are behind you. Like you got to experiment, go for it. And by all means, do what God is telling you to do. But there are some times where I think God goes, hey, like, you know, there's this moment in the Exodus where Moses is at the Red Sea and he's crying out to God, and God's like, what's in your hand? And he's like, oh, the staff. He's like, put the staff into the water. Like I've already given you, like you're looking to me for permission, but I've already set you up with the very thing that you need for this miracle to come to pass. So,
and I think that's part of
leaders. We need to hear that.
So good. I think that's part of it too, right? Is where, and I totally agree with you. We actually say this in the Silicon Valley: fail fast and fail forward, right? It's this culture that's been embraced here that's led to a lot of breakthrough innovation. There's this mentality that, hey, 9 out of 10 things that we're going to try is statistically going to fail, but that one thing is going to be breakthrough. I also think that some of the mindset, like what you just said about Moses, right? Where sometimes when you only have a staff, it's easier to quote unquote risk. It's easier to experiment, right? But if you had like the Mercedes-Benz of staffs and it was like super valuable already, right? And you're like, oh, I don't know, like I don't want to put this out there because it's too much to fail, right?
Yeah.
And you took it to the extreme example of we keep putting God on everything, we keep putting the divine on everything, and it locks us up to actually innovate and have that permission that, hey, not everything is going to work out. Hey, let's close out with this because I want to end on vision. I feel like the theme of this conversation has been innovation, and innovation a lot of times is birthed with a very distinct vision, right? You think about like somebody like a Steve Jobs. He had a vision of a future that did not exist yet that he endeavored to create. And that's what we believe we're doing at Overflow. Our vision for Overflow is to build the infrastructure that makes generosity frictionless across every major asset class. The way that you can buy anything on Amazon, the way that Amazon has all made us bigger spenders, we want you to be able, through Overflow, to be able to give anything through Overflow in the same way that Overflow makes people more generous. Talk to me, Manny. Everything that you're doing personally with Arma, all your different endeavors, give the listeners, just to close out, a vision of what the future looks like for you.
The future looks like a world where it's funny, we bring Sunday school back. Like,
hey, I like that.
It's funny, like a youth pastor picked me up from the airport and we were going to church and he was like, man, I'm sorry, like my church is kind of old school, like we still do Sunday school. And I went, if you ever apologize again or like talk negatively about Sunday school, bro, like actually that's kind of what sustained a whole generation was like Sunday school. And I would say making biblical literacy accessible to everyone anywhere is like my vision. Like making high seminary level, you know, biblical content, super accessible. And that's accessible to Black people, accessible to women, accessible to low income neighborhoods. Like, I've been in Christian schools my entire life. So from kindergarten to my doctorate, I've been educated in Christian environments, and I've never had a black Bible professor. So accessibility is age, it's gender, it's ethnicity, it's, you know, it's cost. It's like, how do we create like seminary level Bible resources for the average person, and make it super, super accessible. And part of accessibility, really, I think that the people who make the Bible the most accessible in society today are pastors. And so we've got a big vision to like help pastors to make the Bible more and more accessible. So yeah, it's a world where biblical literacy is super, super accessible.
I love it.
Zoe, this was one of the most amazing conversations we've had. Manny, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on the Give It Up podcast.
I wasn't too rude for you.
The rudest.
You're the rudest.
Thanks, Manny.
So good.